We're still in our study of Colossians. We're in chapter 3 right now, Colossians chapter 3. I think we pretty much finished up the first section of that chapter. We're going to pick up today with Colossians 3:18. And as I said last week, we'll read on down through Colossians 4:1. If there was ever any doubt about whether or not the verse marks were inspired, this ought to clear that up, because whoever had the job of breaking up the chapters in Colossians missed the break on chapter 4, put it in the wrong spot. You really need Colossians 4:1 in chapter 3, because it's the ending of this passage on submission and obedience. So I'll read Colossians 3, beginning with the 18th verse on through 4:1. Wives, submit unto your own husbands as is fit in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and be not bitter against them. Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing unto the Lord. Fathers, provoke not your children to anger, lest they be discouraged. Servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing God. For whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not unto men, knowing that from the Lord ye shall receive the reward of the inheritance, for ye serve the Lord Christ. But he that doeth wrong shall receive for the wrong which he hath done, and there is no respect of persons. Masters, give unto your servants that which is just and equitable, knowing that ye have a master in heaven. Okay, so as we discuss this section, I wanted to start by kind of mapping it out on the board up here. Because our first instruction that Paul gives to the Colossians is to wives, who are told to submit unto who? Whose husband? Yeah, your own husband. Not your best friend's husband or your neighbor's husband, your own husband. And then there's an instruction to husbands immediately following that, which is what? What is the instruction to husbands? Love, yeah, I'm glad you gave both of those. I'm going to make sure we got both of those. Love is the first, and not be bitter against in the King James. It's worded a few ways. You should not be embittered. Some translations give it a little bit more naturally as do not be harsh with your wife. Second instruction is to children who are to obey. Tells children to obey your parents. And he switches it up slightly here. I don't know if it's significant or not, but the next instruction is not, it doesn't say parents, it says fathers. And fathers are commanded to what? Do not provoke your children to wrath. I'll word it. We'll just put provoke, not to wrath here. We can get your children over here. In our last column. And his final two instructions are first to servants. They're also told to obey. They're told to obey your masters according to the flesh. And then the masters are given instruction to give that which is just and equitable. to your servants. So all these instructions kind of come full circle. We start with wives, we end with wives. We start with children, we come back to children. We start with servants, we come back to servants. Okay, the first thing I want to note, though, is the reason I put this in this chart is it sort of illustrates a lot of the parallels between the things. Wives, husbands, wives, servants, masters, servants. There's some similarities between the things that we're seeing, but it also draws out some differences, one of which is right here. For some reason, Paul has chosen to change words here between the wives and the children and the servants. The wives are told to submit unto their husbands, but the children and the servants are told to obey. So any ideas on what's the difference between to submit to and to obey? Maybe it's the same. That's a possibility. When you submit to someone, you typically have some obedience. And if you obey, you probably feel like you're submitting to. But it's not the same word. It's not the same word in English. It's not the same word in the Greek. So maybe it's the same. Normally, when you're writing and you want to maintain parallelism, both in English and in ancient languages. So I don't know that it's an accident, though, but that's a thought. Does anyone feel that it's just the same, that he's used a different word but wants to convey the same idea? Serve his authority. You don't want, yeah, submit, you're saying, comes to the idea of not usurping the authority. Okay. Other thoughts? Okay. So, sort of summarize that, could obey be an obligation and submission to a certain degree involves some choosing? Maybe not just totally a choice because there's some instruction here, but not the same, maybe not the same kind of obligation that obey carries, that at a certain point, a wife is choosing to do this, okay? Is that, I put the question marks here because that's been suggested, but I just want to keep the question out there. Is that correct? Is that incorrect? What do you think? You agree? Okay. Yeah. So you agree with that? Why? Okay, well, here, I'll keep thinking about it because I want to discuss this a little bit, but I'll give you a little bit of what I found. The word submit here. So again, I said these are different in the Greek. I don't know how to say this word, hypotasethi, to subordinate reflexively. To obey is one of the definitions that Strong's gives, but also to be under obedience to, or to put under, subdue unto, to make subject, be put in subjection, and submit self unto, whereas the word for obey is to hear as a subordinate, that is to listen attentively, and to heed and conform to a command or authority. So I think there may be a little bit more idea here of sort of listening to orders and conforming to them. And here you're talking about a form of obedience, but this is the same submission used in Ephesians 5:21, where it says, submit to one another out of reverence to Christ, where every Christian is commanded to submit. So in that case, we're not told to obey everyone, we're told to submit unto everyone. And I want to talk a little bit more about that later, but just for now, that may give us some indication of how submit is a little bit different than obedience. But this is in some sense related to the kind of submission that we give everyone else. I don't think it's exactly the same as the submission we give to each other. Again, we'll come to that, but it is the same word that's used in Ephesians 5:21. So if you've been thinking about it, what do we have? To align, right, for a wife to align her ways with her husband. And another idea I think this is getting at in the Greek is this is more of establishing the headship or we're respecting the headship of the husband in the family, rather than simply putting her in the role of a child where a father, she just listens and he does. She's not under him as a child. She's not under him in the same way that a servant is under a master, but she is under him in that he has a higher rank, and that she therefore has to conform her way of thinking to respect his greater authority in the family. But it does seem to be in a lesser sense than the way the child and the servant simply has to do. Maybe there's a problem if you treat your wife like you treat your children, or if you're a boss and you treat your wife the way you treat your employees. Maybe this signals to you that there's a problem there, because that's not exactly the same relationship. Yeah, there's a choice that happens. Both parties had some say in entering into this relationship, whereas these are things that sort of simply happen to you. Okay, now I mentioned Ephesians 5:21. Thought I'd written that down. Let me go to that passage. There's a lot of similarities between Colossians and Ephesians, and between Colossians and Philippians. This is one of those similarities with Ephesians. And he gives a similar passage here, where in verse 22 of Ephesians 5, he starts with, wives, submit to your own husband as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. And this sort of gives us a little bit more of an idea of what submission is by giving us sort of an analogy with Christ's headship of the church. But if you go back before that passage, 5:22, back to 5:21, it says submitting to one another out of reverence to Christ. So he doesn't repeat that concept of submitting to one another here in Colossians before he tells wives to submit to their husbands. He only does that in Ephesians. But in Ephesians, he puts these two ideas together, which to me suggests that there must be some difference in wives submitting to their husbands and Christians submitting to each other. Otherwise, there's no point even talking about wives submitting to their husbands if husbands are supposed to submit to their wives in exactly the same way that wives submit to their husbands. But having said that, it's the same word for submission. The word that he uses to tell Christians to submit to their fellow Christians is the same word he immediately uses in Ephesians and now here in Colossians to describe the way wives are to submit to their husbands. So what is the difference? Or am I wrong? And there is no difference. What is the difference between the way you as a Christian submit to your fellow Christians and the way a wife submits to her husband? Or you can say they're the same, because it's the same, it is the same word. So the husband and the wife are one, and you're not, so there may be a difference in context here, right? There's a different relationship. But because the husband and the wife have a different relationship than a Christian and a fellow Christian, the type of submission and the level of submission may be different. Because I think Paul has to be, he has to be driving at something. I don't think he can simply be saying here, wives, submit to your husbands the same way your husband is already submitting to you because you're both Christians and all Christians submit to each other. Therefore, this passage doesn't really mean anything. It's just, I don't think that's the case. I think he brings this up for a specific reason. I don't think he's trying to restate half of the point he's already made, that everybody in the body of Christ is supposed to submit to everyone else in the body of Christ. There is a type of submission going on here that goes beyond that. And I think you're right. I think the context is important, that the husband and the wife are one. And so the kind of relationship they're going to have is naturally going to be different. But other ideas? Yeah, that's a good point. He brings this up everywhere. So every church seems to have an issue here, and probably not just with wives submitting to their husbands. Also, they probably have trouble with husbands loving their wives and not being bitter against their wives. So this comes into play too. So my next question is, if you're a husband and your wife is not in submission to you, what do you do? What are you supposed to do? Yeah, I guess you could tell an elder. Yeah, the first thing is you have to love her. It's not an excuse not to love her. It doesn't say if your wife submits unto her husband, then the husband should love and not be bitter to her. So this doesn't go away. That's an important point. Has anybody seen the movie The Quiet Man? John Wayne? No John Wayne fans in here? Oh, it's a classic movie. So if you've ever seen the movie The Quiet Man, at the end of the movie, John Wayne's wife is not in submission to him. And there's a scene where he goes to the train station to get her. She's trying to leave on a train. And they say that he's walking her back, which basically means dragging her 5 miles back to the village. And it's everybody gets excited. They all come out to watch. At one point, a little old lady picks up a stick and says, here's a stick to beat the lovely lady with, and gives it to John Wayne. And this leads to the big fight with her brother at the climax of the film. So is that how you get your wife who's not submitting to submit? Walk her back to the village? Why not? That's the key. I know you're going to say no, but why not? It's illegal? Okay, that's an okay answer. I'm looking for a better answer. I'm looking for the best answer to this.
It's not showing love.
It's not showing love, and really even more directly, it's this command not to be harsh with her. And a reason, but
she's at the train station. What should you do?
Okay, we'll come back to that, but I want to make one point real quick is the reason I bring this up is I think that when I ask that question, should you drag your wife, 5 miles back from the train station? Our inclination is to say, well, duh, of course not. But I want to think about what the reason is. The reason really is because that's not what we've been taught by the apostles, and that's not what it is to be in the body of Christ. There's a tendency, I think, to get this idea that, well, society just tells us that wrong. I mean, you brought it up. You said it's illegal. It's not just illegal. You'd be shamed by everyone in Lexington, Kentucky. It'd be in all the papers. You see that horrible guy and what he did. So our society, our very secular, non-Christian society tells us that that's wrong, and we just sort of absorb that. But the reason I bring up a movie like The Quiet Man is here's a guy who's living in a village in Ireland in the 1920s where it's not a taboo. Everyone's glad he finally did it. They're following him back to the village. They're all happy for him. They're cheering him along. If you let society decide what is and is not the right way to treat your wife, then that's going to change as society changes. This command, however, to not be bitter against your wife is never going to change. It's always going to be there. So this needs to be the reason that we think that is not a Christian attitude. Not because our society has evolved to say that's not a Christian attitude, but because Paul is telling us all along that wasn't a Christian attitude. And now you brought up the question though, so what do you do? So yeah, what should John Wayne have done? If you've seen the movie, it's particularly complicated because, he's almost put in a situation where he doesn't have any choice. No one's ever going, even his wife is never going to accept him because he's not living by, he's the quiet man of the title, right? He wants to this is how he wants to live, but everyone is sort of conspiring to make that impossible. Correct. So someone has seen the film, yeah. Yeah, it is. I think they describe it in the movie as Homeric. But what should he do? In the film, he does what is expected of him in that society. But if you're part of the Christian, if Christian is your nationality, if Christian is who you are, what should he have done? That was the question. Anybody have an answer?
She shouldn't have done it.
Right, she shouldn't have. Yeah, this sort of assumes that wives, you have a responsibility to do what you're supposed to do, and husbands, you have a responsibility to do what you're supposed to do. And if you both do those things, the family works. But the question has still been asked: what should you do? How did Christ bring the church into submission? Great question. What's the answer? How did Christ bring the church into submission? Love, patience, sacrifice. At what point does Christ, come down after his resurrection and just drag everybody, to Jerusalem and say, let's get a few things straight. We're no more lollygagging around. Anybody who doesn't get with the program now, I'm just going to cast you away and never forgive you. When did he do that?
No matter how much you drag her down the street, it's her choice.
Okay.
You can't make anybody submit.
Okay. So I feel like we're leaning towards there's really nothing the husband can do to 100% guarantee that this is going to happen. He can just keep on doing what's expected of him and not really force this issue. But let me ask you this. Do we have the same attitude towards husbands that are not loving and are being harsh against their wives? Is there no recourse for the wife? In other words, if the husband is being harsh with the wife, does the wife just take it? Or can she get other Christians involved? Does she get the eldership involved? Yeah, I think so too. I think in this case, we're probably very reluctant to say you can't get anyone else involved. So let's now bring it back over here. Someone brought up get the elders involved. Are there maybe things that we can do as a husband can do? I mean, we talked a little bit last week about when someone sins against you, right? There are things you do, right? You go to them with witnesses, you take them to the elders. Is this situation special? Is this not, or does that same thing apply here? I think it would be the same. You start with your wife and you say, look, you are not obeying what Paul has commanded here in submission. And you say why you feel that way. And she says, no, yes, I am. And so you bring some witnesses in, and the witnesses say, no, we understand why you think you're doing right, but really you're not. And then ultimately you would take it to the elders. But all that, of course, assumes that both of these parties are going to respect the eldership and respect the will of the church. So you can certainly get in cases where one party or the other is simply not living up to their obligation, not trying to live up to their obligation, or not going to listen to anyone. And there may be cases where you just have to keep on doing what is expected of you. And in the case of husbands, keep on loving your wives, keep on not being harsh. Or in the case of wives, keep on submitting, even though you're dealing with someone who's not doing what they're supposed to. Okay, let's look at children. It's similar here. Children, obey your parents. Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. What about in this one? In this case, what if the children are not obeying? What's the father supposed to do about it? Give it a whooping. Okay, so let's go back to number one. If a father can whoop the child for not obeying, why can't the husband whoop the wife for not submitting? Okay, yeah, that doesn't say that in the Bible. Other thoughts?
It is the father's role to guide the children. And it's not the husband's role to guide the wife in the way he's guiding the children. Okay, so that we couldn't hear that. The father and the husband have different roles. The father has a role to guide the child, and the husband does not have that same role of guiding the wife. And maybe that brings us back to our question about the difference between obedience and submission. Maybe this ties into that as well. Maybe obedience is the word you want to use to describe this relationship where you just have to do, and if you don't do, you're going to be punished. And maybe submission describes this relationship where it's not quite like that. And even when you don't do, you still have this command to not be bitter against or to not be harsh with. It doesn't say, fathers, don't be harsh with your children. It says, don't provoke them to wrath.
but it doesn't use this, it doesn't have the same language it has with the wife. So it's not the same relationship. Yeah, husbands and wives are become one flesh, and how do you treat your own flesh? You need to treat your wife the way you treat your own flesh. Whereas with children, it's a little bit different. And again, I think the really good point was made that you have a different responsibility. Why? You said that you should punish the child if they don't obey, but why? Why do you punish the child when they don't obey? Because you're mad and you want to get even with the child? Teach them. Right, but it's still part of, you said teach. You mentioned that before the punishment, but when you punish, it's still teaching, right? Yeah, it's not, well, I will show that kid, I'll get even with him for everything what I said. It's part of teaching, it's part of admonition, it's part of training that child to live properly. So you have that responsibility with the child, and you need punishment as a way of doing that. You, as was said, you don't have that responsibility with your wife. Your wife is already grown up, she's already an adult. You're not trying to train her in the ways of the Lord. Not in that sense.
There are two separate approaches to authority or power. One is worldly, the other one is modeled after what Christ has done. The worldly approach to power is, I'm from the top, and therefore I tell you what to do. If you don't line up, I will beat you into submission. Okay. The other is from a position from supporting and encouraging, leading, from a position at the bottom, you empower the person. When the disciples came to Jesus, were arguing about which one was the greatest one. He said the Gentiles lord it over one another, and their great men exercise authority over one another. But it's not so amongst you. Whoever wishes to be greatest becomes the servant, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. Connects back with Ephesians chapter 5, Colossians 2, or Colossians 3, from the standpoint of Jesus being the one that submits himself in self-sacrificial service, so the husband does the same. The wife now wants. Right. They've got a whole new approach. Children now have a whole new approach. Servants have a whole new approach, because the recognition is that we're doing this in light of this new understanding. And when I think about that and what that must have meant in the first century, and how this must have hit people of the first century, were regarding wives and children as property and servants as property. And Paul comes on the scene and says, no, this is the way. We're going to do this in the fear of Christ. We're going to submit as the Lord has submitted, and we're going to operate by a whole new set of standards.
Yeah, amen. And I think that's a great comment. And I think I'm glad that you're kind of in the center and speak loud, because I think I can't really repeat all that, but I think everyone could hear that. And I think that's, that's the idea here, is this is our standard for how these relationships go, comes from Christ and not from the world, which, it's sort of what I was getting at with, why you're not to be harsh with your wife. It's not because 21st century American society tells you not to be harsh with your wife. 21st century American society tells you a lot of other things too that are not true. But it's because it's part of the eternal truths of God. And we have to think about these relationships and what it means to have authority and what it means to submit in light of what Christ teaches us and what Christ demonstrates us, rather than what the world teaches us about these things.
As a Christian, I haven't submitted to Christ if he hasn't won my heart.
Yeah.
As a wife, I haven't submitted to my husband unless the husband has won my heart. Same thing with children, same thing with servants. And so in this passage is the relationship with the Lord that governs all.
Yeah, amen. And I think that's why you see two sides to all these relationships, whereas it's not in this sort of authoritative world standard where it would just end right here. Okay, other thoughts on wives or children before we get into servants? So with servants, Paul tells the servants to obey your masters according to the flesh. And then masters give that which is just and equitable to your servants. Why does he qualify masters with this phrase, according to the flesh? Why not just say masters? I mean, he could have said children according to the flesh, right? Children in the physical sense rather than.
Ultimately, God is our master.
Right, God is our master.
Master of the flesh in accordance to God's will. Obey that, but if he is asking us to do something other than serving God.
Right. So masters of the flesh is in contrast to the master. And when you get to verse 1 of chapter 4, he mentions our master in heaven. So since he's going to talk about the master in heaven, he's making a distinction now, making clear which master he's talking about. And I think it also emphasizes the fact that if you're a Christian and someone says, you're a Christian, but you're also a servant, and Paul says, obey your master, and the Christian says, what do you mean my master? I only got one master, right? My master is the Lord. My master is God. I'll obey. You want me to obey my master? Sure, I'll obey God. But Paul's point here is that's not what I'm talking about. Yes, you have a master in heaven, but many of you have masters according to the flesh here on earth, and you have to obey them too. So why should these servants serve these masters who are their masters according to the flesh if they're also serving the one true master in heaven? Why do they also need to serve these masters? Fearing the Lord, okay. Good, true.
Wouldn't it be the same as, employer is not our master, but he knows for us.
Yeah, we don't have, I mean, the word servant could mean a slave, but it's a broader word, and a lot of us are servants. We have people who we don't call them masters, we call them bosses. But I think absolutely we draw application from this. You should obey your boss at work, but why? Why should you obey your boss? It's the Lord. Yeah, that's right, because it's the Lord who you serve. And who is going to, he makes the point, who is going to reward you for this service? God. That's who he says is actually going to. So you, as a servant, as an employee, you obey your master, your boss, not because they're going to reward you, but because the master who is in heaven is going to reward you. And if the master who is in heaven is going to ultimately reward you for your service, who are you really working for? Who are you really serving? You're serving him, right? People don't reward you for serving someone else. Paul is saying when you serve your master here on earth, you're serving God. And because you're serving God, God is going to be the one who rewards you. So that's what you're working for. You know, he says, not as men pleasers. If you please your boss, you say all the right things, and you're always on time, you do good work, you always tell your boss, great job, boss, you always have his cup of coffee ready for him. There's a reward, right? You might get a raise, you might get a promotion, work might go easier for you. But that's not the real reward that you're seeking. That's not really what the servant is supposed to be trying to gain. The servant should keep in mind that there is another master, and you are serving that master when you serve your earthly master. And that master is the one who's going to give you a reward that's really worth having, that's imperishable. It's not just 25 cents more an hour or whatever. What's that? Oh, win over your boss. Yeah, your boss is not necessarily a Christian. So then it doesn't say if he's not a Christian, don't obey him. Right? So this could be a non-Christian boss. And the comment was made, you're being an example to him. You may even win his son.
Later on, it says, if you do, put it in practice. do.
Right. Right, absolutely. Okay, any other thoughts or comments? We're at the end of chapter 3, so we can go on in and talk about chapter 4 next, but we're getting close to the end of class, so I want to make sure that we're done with this topic. And anything you've thought about, any questions you have, any comments you want to make, and anything from this section before we wrap up chapter 3. As I said, I really want you guys to control what we talk about in this class, so don't be shy.
The idea that Christ is the ultimate example is no problem, which is he sets his example for the life of the lived. He laid down his life for us, died for us, giving us those examples of the torment, the punishments that he went through. This is so unworldly. This idea of looking at all of these things is so much unlike the world. We're a different set apart. We live this way. We're going to stand out.
Yeah, absolutely. If you couldn't hear that on the right side, we're talking about Christ being the ultimate example in all this. And really, that passage you looked at in Ephesians, where he's telling wives to submit to their husbands there, he directly makes that analogy, that it's that submit to your husbands the way the church submits to Christ. And that, I mean, we are followers of Christ. That's, you know, we obey his commandments, but we obey his commandments because we are followers of Christ. So ultimately, Christ is our example for everything that we do. We're not just listening, we're not just writing down the things he said to do and then trying to do them based on our own interpretation. We're doing them based in the light of how Christ has shown us to do them. Great. Anything else? Okay, well, I guess we will then go ahead and get into chapter 4. Probably won't get into it too far, but let's start by reading the chapter. I want to skip the first verse since we've already read it and just read us out here. Continue in prayer and watch therein with thanksgiving. Besides praying also for us that God would open unto us a door of utterance to speak the mystery of Christ, for which I am also in bonds, that I may make it manifest as I ought to speak, walk in wisdom towards those who are outsiders, redeeming the time. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer every man. Tychicus, who is a beloved brother and a faithful minister and fellow servant in the Lord, shall declare unto you all my circumstances. I have sent him unto you for the same purpose, that he might know your state and comfort your hearts. And with him, Onesimus, a faithful and beloved brother, who is one of you, they shall make known unto you all things which are done here. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, saluteth you, and also Mark, Barnabas' sister's son, concerning whom ye receive instructions, that if he come unto you, receive him. And Jesus, who is called Justus, who are of the circumcision. These only are my fellow workers for the kingdom of God, who have been a comfort unto me. Epaphras, a servant of Christ, who is one of you, saluteth you, always laboring fervently for you in prayers, that ye may stand perfect and complete in all the will of God. For I bear him record that he hath a great zeal for you and for those who are in Laodicea and those in Hierapolis. Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. Salute the brethren who are in Laodicea and Nymphos and the church which is in his house. And when this epistle is read among you, cause that it be read also in the church of the Laodiceans, and likewise read the epistle from Laodicea. And say to Archippus, take heed to the ministry which thou hast received in the Lord, and thou fulfill it. The salutation by the hand of me, Paul. Remember my bonds. Grace be with you. Amen. Okay. So there in verse 2, when we started reading, Paul told them to continue in prayer and watch therein with thanksgiving. This word watch, sometimes stay alert, sometimes be diligent. why do the Colossians need to not just pray? What does it mean to watch when you pray? It sort of, to me, conjures up notions of a guard, being vigilant, watching. What are we being on alert, looking at? What are we looking out for?
There's people who want to pervert the word.
There are people who want to pervert the word, people who want to come in and do sinful things. To be alert to that was what was said. What else? Other thoughts? Why does he bring this up here? Why is this? What does this have to do with prayer?
Bring us closer to God, and our relationship with Him. And in doing so, this also helps us to always do His will and keep our lives in perspective.
Okay, so maybe there's a connection between these ideas. When we're praying, we're getting closer to God. And, that's going to be what makes it possible for us to be vigilant, to be on the lookout, and to watch for these things which may get brought in. And the reason I want to emphasize this is because he's not just saying pray. If he's saying that's something we need to do, but he goes a little bit farther here when he says to watch and pray. So he's not just telling them to have a constant prayer life. He's specifically instructing them to watch out. And are we watching out? Are you watching out? When you pray at night, is one of your concerns, one of the things, or pray at any time, one of your thoughts is that I need to be careful, that there are things that I need to be watchful for. Do you feel there are things you need to be watchful for in this world? Maybe this just applied to the Colossians. In 21st century America, are there things that Christians need to be looking out for? Yes. The things that and it could be, so it could be personal. So there may be things that the church as a whole has to watch out for, right there. And those are kind of the ones that maybe we're the most aware of because, we all have preachers who stand up and remind us about the digressions of the world and encourage us to avoid them. But then there are those personal things you have to watch out for, right? There are those sins that are waiting to trip you up. Are you being watchful for those? So I think both of those ideas are contained here.
I just noticed, develop yourself to pray. Keeping on work, attitude of thanksgiving. So, it says that you might not think.
Oh, yeah. So I kind of stopped short, right? It's not just to be alert. What's the next thing? Mary points out is Thanksgiving. So there's another side to our prayers, right? Our prayers is a time we need to be alert. We need to be watchful. We need to be making sure that we're avoiding sin, that we're avoiding temptation. But it's also a time of thanksgiving. And that's another way in which Mary's bringing out prayers come up short. Are your prayers thankful enough? I think I mentioned this class before that I've kind of noticed that sometimes I have more gimmies in my prayers than thanks. And I think there used to be, I don't think people use it as much anymore, but I think there used to be sort of a pattern of thinking of everything you could be thankful for in your prayer and then asking for stuff. Even though you're asking for stuff that's very godly, you still wanted to make sure that you thanked God for everything He's given you first, so that you never became ungrateful for all that God has given you. So that's a great encouragement there. We do need to make sure that our prayers focus as much on thankfulness as they do on, even as much on thankfulness as they do, lead me not into temptation. Yeah, and so the comment was prayers can become selfish. And I want to caution, I think you said it right. The way to avoid selfish prayers is to be more thankful. I don't think that if you feel like you're asking for too much in your prayers, I don't think the solution is to ask for less. I think you should ask. I think you should throw it all, give it all to the Lord. Because if you want something in your life, if you need something in your life, God is the best place to turn for it. So don't ask for less, but give more thanks. I think that's where our prayers become selfish, is not because we cast all our cares on the Lord. The Lord's there for all your cares. Our prayers become selfish when all we do is cast our cares on the Lord, and we don't spend enough time thanking him for all the many, many, many wonderful things he has already blessed us. Okay, I think we're about to wrap up. Final thoughts. We'll finish up chapter 4 next time, but anything else to talk about this morning? All right.
Just not get comfortable with that thankfulness. Say my experience that if you write it down, this idea of writing down your prayers, and then you go back and you look and like, oh my goodness, these wrong prayers. And then those may have been big prayers that we were asking for. So how about the small prayers when we ask for just say try and we actively say thank you.
Yeah.
Giving them all great reward for everything that brings us through. And just writing those down and go back and read those and wow, the thankfulness that you will feel, it is amazing.
Okay, that's a great idea. If you couldn't hear that, the thought was writing down those things you're praying for. Because when you go back and look at those things, you will see that many of those prayers have been answered, and then the thankfulness that comes from it. So that's a great idea. All right, anything else? Okay, we will probably finish up. I'm actually positive we'll finish up Colossians next time. We'll look at chapter 4 and talk about the rest of it. And thank you all very much.